So the question is, why should we discuss biosimilars? And I think it's probably fair to say that this group might have a difference of opinion with respect to the path forward for biosimilars in Canada. Is that a fair comment? No, I think that's a good thing, because with differences of opinion come different options and ultimately better decisions that are made. So as Chris mentioned, the IHE has a long history of bringing together groups that have differences of opinion and really discussing and debating the policy options and coming up with hopefully the best path forward. And so in the fall of 2016, we had an initial group that came together for really the first foray that the IHE went into this area of biotopics on. And we had some international speakers that shared largely the European perspective. So what's been tried in Europe, what were the outcomes that were achieved, what were the lessons learned. And you can see here, we had a large group, quite similar to the composition of the group here. We had folks from various perspectives, be they payers, patient groups, clinicians, originator and biosimilar industry. And we had people seated at these U-shaped tables, these conference-style tables that went actually all the way across the room. And we seated people very deliberately according to their perspective, with the goal that much of the table discussion really reflected the different perspectives that were in the room. And this was an 8-hour full-day session. Very grateful for the time that people committed to this. And about 4 hours of this meeting was conversation at the table. So one potential outcome that we might have observed was really, violent disagreement. And Chris and Laura, you can't have expected to come to Canada in playoff season and not had a hockey reference. Now, this is maybe your first because it's Sunday, but unlikely to be your last during your time here. So fortunately, as Chris mentioned, we're not that type of a society typically, aside from the hockey rink, and we didn't observe this outcome. And a second potential outcome was that we all held hands and sang Kumbaya. Now, that didn't exactly happen either. However, we came fairly close. So the objective of that meeting really was to look at what are the enabling elements for the successful introduction of biosimilars in Canada. And I think it was very encouraging to see that with that diverse group there, with all that time to debate and discuss, we really landed on something that was sort of a multifactorial approach that really suggested all the key, or hopefully most of the key considerations to think about as we develop our strategy for Canada. I don't know that we answered every question, but we certainly raised a bit of a framework, and we're calling sort of the elements to consider as we go forward. So what we identified were really 5 enabling elements that we feel are important collectively to help each stakeholder achieve their objectives with biosimilars. And what's implied in that statement is that one is not enough. So a policy around reimbursement is not sufficient to achieve objectives. You have to have other things in place that are complementary and supplementary to that one individual approach. So we came up with 5. It might not be an exhaustive list, but I think it's a very good starting point and something we're hoping to build on today. And the IHE in general likes to take on topics like biosimilars and really progress through various stages so that the conversation is not a one-off and done, but rather we have a starting point, which is this. We have some follow-ups, which is this meeting that we have here today. We've also got a platform, which you may have seen, which is the IHE Open Innovation Platform for the conversations to continue online. And we're taking sort of a programmatic approach to really working over a number of different initiatives to move the biosimilars conversation forward. So we'll step through each of these elements separately just to set the stage for today, and we'll conclude on the last 2, which are really the focus for this afternoon. In terms of competition, it's clear that active and sustained competition is really required in order for Canada to achieve the benefit from biosimilars over the long term. But the real challenge associated with that is how do we ensure the most inclusive, transparent, and fair process to originators, yet support long-term interests of biosimilar manufacturers to remain in the market. And the group really came up with a number of considerations to think about, which include the inclusiveness of competitive processes, the methodology for how value is measured. Is it just price, or is there something beyond price that we have to think about? The number of products provided market access, and we can dissect that even further into for which patient segments, for which therapeutic indications. And then finally, the longevity of reimbursement decisions. Now, we heard from a Norwegian speaker that described an annual sort of winner-takes-all tendering process, and the group, some folks said, that might not be something that is a reflective competition model that supports what we're describing here as a long-term, sort of sustainable, active, competitive market. The next element was an effective procurement strategy. So encouragingly, the focus of that conversation throughout the entire day was really grounded on patients first and grounded on doing the right thing for the healthcare system in terms of sustainability. So the first principle that emerged was really differentiate first on evidence and then on other things. And so with respect to those other things, we looked a bit at value, and value was described by the group as really beyond price. It includes price, of course, but it must include things such as quality, the services provided, the reliability of supply, sort of other elements that go into that value equation. And then, of course, to ensure that the strategy for procurement is sustainable over time. And this is not a static market. This is a very fast-moving sort of multi-pronged beast that we're all trying to tackle here. And we need to have a strategy that anticipates new originator biologics coming on board. We have to have a strategy that anticipates a significant number of biosimilars. And you've probably all seen that chart that shows there's many, many companies with many, many biosimilars for the same agents or the same biologics that are in the pipeline. And we have to anticipate what happens when biosimilar 1 is followed by 2, 3, 4, and 5, and so on. And then also a dynamic biologic agent context. So the originators and others, they're not static. So indications might change over time. Place in therapy might change over time. So lots of moving parts. The point here is that the strategy for procurement must anticipate this and not be sort of a one and done and a one-size-fits-all approach. And then finally, the strategy should align with the interest in monitoring experience and outcomes over time. So again, that Norwegian model was one where winner takes all, annual process, and one can imagine that patients might go from originator to biosimilar A, to biosimilar B, to biosimilar C, and that might make it difficult to track and attribute what we're seeing in terms of patient outcomes to a particular agent. So the strategy that we choose here should align with that interest in monitoring. The group recognized, obviously in the biologic space, that there are a lot of enablers, or a lot of elements in the infrastructure that are enablers to a change in practice. And these things include things like product and delivery supports, education, experience programs, patient support programs, and in many cases, these are currently originator manufacturer supported. So we need to think very carefully about a situation where we might have a number of originators in the market, a number of biosimilars in the market, and all these different enablers have to sort of line up with that. And think carefully about sort of not just maintaining what we currently have in terms of the quality and the things that are provided to patients and clinics, maybe even enhancing that, but also think about the transition. So imagine a patient moving off of an originator to a biosimilar. Well, how would they move, or should they move, from a manufacturer-supported patient program to an originator manufacturer patient support program to a biosimilar? Or patients migrating between provinces that might have different reimbursements. So what it really needs or suggests is a need for coordination between provinces, coordination between the public and private sector, and probably some sort of leadership to look overall at the infrastructure and understand what do we have and how do we maintain that or even improve that with a number of different manufacturers now operating in the same space. Evidence and monitoring. So this is going to be the focus of much of the conversation today. The group suggested, again, first, let's start with identifying where best judgment suggests we currently have enough data. And today we're going to speak about some frameworks that help us do that. And then where we don't feel we have enough data, let's continue to build the evidence base for biosimilars, including real-world data to support real-world evidence. And then once we start that process, let's build some KPIs or a bit of a dashboard. KPIs are key performance indicators to help us monitor and report on outcomes relative to policy objectives over time. So the group had suggested things like safety, clinical and economic outcomes, utilization, appropriateness. So we can imagine potentially cost-effectiveness equations changing with price changes for biologics, and therefore places in therapy changing and new patients getting biologics where they weren't otherwise. So we have to measure really the appropriateness of all that. And then, of course, capturing the things from the patient's perspective as well. And of course, it was no surprise to those in this room that patients and providers really have to be aligned with policy in order for us to achieve our objectives. And so there's a requirement for education that has to be appropriate to our healthcare culture. The education should probably use clinical champions to encourage both experience as well as to share the evidence. And we need to also build our monitoring processes over time and share what we're doing so that we're giving comfort to the stakeholders, in particular patients and clinicians, that we have a plan in place to monitor, capture, iterate, change, modify as we go forward. So focus of today, the two elements are evidence and monitoring and education and experience. So we're going to hear about an option for a framework to help us understand how to categorize and consider biosimilars because of course it's not a homogeneous set of agents. This is a very diverse mix of different products, different patients, acute, chronic, all kinds of different moving parts for each. And so how do we categorize and slot those into different things that helps us make decisions upon which we have some significant comfort? And then secondly, what's the process we can use to engage stakeholders to identify place in therapy and further evidence development that's required as we move things forward? And we have some good experience from Scotland to help us with that. And then finally, education and experience. So an approach to knowledge exchange that allows us all to really have a common view and a shared agreement around what the current interpretation of the evidence is as we move forward.